Welcome to another program of Searching for Answers. My name is Carolyn Thompson, and on my right is...
John Jones, La Sierra University.
John Pauline, Loma Linda University.
Ivan Blazin, Loma Linda University.
Ivan, now you were saying something to me which I didn't quite get just as we were getting started. It's very important, so I'm going to let you tell about it.
Well, actually, you also in the previous program said this was very important, and I'm kind of echoing your words.
Okay.
And that's the first 5 verses. I think they're important.
This is Luke 23.
Luke 23, first 5 verses. Should we read those again?
Sure.
Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man, number 1, perverting our nation. Number 2, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor. Third, saying he himself is the Messiah, a king." And there's a 4th charge that comes up a little bit later, but then we'll continue reading. Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He said, "You say so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against this man." But they were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea from Galilee, where he began, even to this place." Now, here are the charges against Jesus. And these would be charges, if any charges would provoke Rome, these would be the charges that would provoke Rome. Perverting the nation of the Jews, I don't know how much that provokes them, and maybe something in that too. But forbidding us to pay taxes to Caesar, that's an absolute no-no. Caesar's in control. Saying that he is the Messiah, or they charged him with this, he is a king. I mean, this is a counter force to the emperor. And when it says down in verse 5 that he stirs up the people all the way from Galilee to here, well, stirring up the people, this can be read as an insurrectionist who's going to lead a rebellion against Rome. And the very fact from Galilee to here, I mean, Galilee is the place where a lot of these types come from. So these are charges that would be especially pertinent to Rome and could inflame Rome.
Could I read it in Phillips, just a few verses that you read there? This is chapter 23. Then they rose up in a body and took him off to Pilate and began their accusation in these words, quotes, "Here is this man whom we have found corrupting our people and telling them that it is wrong to pay taxes to Caesar, claiming that he himself is Christ, a king." But Pilate addressed his question to Jesus. "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Yes, I am," he replied. Then Pilate spoke to the chief priests and the crowd. "I find nothing criminal about this man." But they pressed their charge, saying, "He's a troublemaker among the people. He teaches through the whole of Judea, all the way from Galilee to this place." When Pilate heard this, he inquired whether the man were a Galilean, and when he discovered that he came under Herod's jurisdiction, he passed him on to Herod, who happened to be in Jerusalem at the time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was delighted, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time. He had heard a lot about Jesus and was hoping to see him perform a miracle. He questioned him very thoroughly, but Jesus gave him absolutely no reply. Though the chief priests and scribes stood there making the most violent accusations. So Herod joined his own soldiers in scoffing and jeering at Jesus. Finally, they dressed him up in a gorgeous cloak and sent him back to Pilate. On that day, Herod and Pilate became firm friends, though previously they had been at daggers drawn.
You know, Phillips usually gets it mighty right, and I'm so impressed with his handling of the text. his translation has a vigor that is often lost in translations, but is present in the original. I would, however, beg to differ with his translation of verse 3, where he has Jesus reply, "Yes, I am," when he's asked, "Are you king?" The original there, "Su leges," is simply, "Well, you say so." Or if you want, you could almost translate it, "Well, if you say so," if that's the way you want it. But nonetheless...
Sort of like whatever.
Yeah,
Mine
that's right,
says,
kind of a dismissive, yeah,
Pilate
whatever.
asked
That's
Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied.
I would rather
What
that
version
than-
is that? NIV?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, New International.
Well, now I'm surprised at that.
Yeah.
I would rather it be "if you say so," or "if that's the way you want it," something like that.
Yeah, that is the idea.
There's an ambiguity about that, and only in such an answer can we understand Pilate coming back and saying, "I can't find anything wrong with this fellow." Yeah.
But why indeed does Pilate say, "I find nothing wrong"? If those charges held
Are
true,
true.
then he ought to find a lot wrong with Jesus. I mean, his Roman furor ought to be raised at that point. At least he would want to investigate it. But this is an interesting thing. Luke has a trait, and he's always, Jesus is innocent, and the disciples are innocent, and the innocence motif runs through the gospel and through Acts itself. So I just, when I never expected this statement on his part, but he makes it, and they come back with a counter. Well, as a matter of fact, he's agitating the people. Now, that's precisely what Rome couldn't have done.
Why were Pilate and Herod enemies?
The political arrangement was a mess, for
it?
starts.
Okay.
Maybe that's the first thing to say. Rome wanted to always work through puppets, in all of its conquered countries. Herod was half Jew, half Edomite. Had been in power before, but Rome left him in there for the ethnicity value that he represented, but still you've got the political power over. Now there were some differences in jurisdiction, as you can see. Herod has more to do with Galilee, but nonetheless there's a built-in tension there between a local ruler and the empire. It was not only the case there, it was the case in many of the countries where Rome held sway that there
How
was
could somebody
potential
who
for
was
this.
half Jewish become in Herod's position?
He was a clever rascal.
He's related to those other rascals in there,
Yes.
too.
His mother was Jewish, his father was pure Edomite. His father was simply a functionary in the ruling house of the Hasmoneans, but he insinuated himself into power, and Herod benefited from that. It's a long and complicated story, but for our purposes,
Well, it's interesting. Only Luke tells the story
yeah.
about Herod. Why do you suppose? What is this dynamic here all about?
It's interesting that you captured in a previous conversation Luke's ability to hook things into the political picture of the day. This may be one more example of that. Luke is a very matter-of-fact person in many ways, and I think simply, first of all, this is a trait that we see with Luke, that Luke deals with the real world.
Well, don't you think
But-
the fact that he was a physician and a good one
Could have been part of the
just spilled over into
psychology
this
of the
type
day.
of thing?
That's
yeah,
right.
but go ahead.
Yeah, well, in addition to that, it may be that Luke actually is explaining an historical phenomenon here, that there was a bit of a reconciliation between them, and that people knew that, and Luke is saying the occasion for it was the story of the man I'm telling you about, which may not have been known before. Interesting, isn't it?
It is. It is.
It's also interesting that Jesus speaks to Pilate, but he doesn't speak to Herod.
Yeah.
Yeah, how come?
Well, it almost seems as if he knew Herod in a way that Pilate was new. I mean, this is a foreigner, not somebody that you encountered on the street. For some reason or other, Herod was just on a different level. Now, we know from other sources that apparently Herod had crossed some lines spiritually and was no longer open really to the message. Pilate, on the other hand, was not closed. He had not ruled out these things. He was asking, some of his questions were honest, not all of them. There was still a possibility for Pilate, but Herod,
Maybe their friendship also may have had something to do with the fact that, as will be mentioned, and down in verse 15, that with Pilate talking, that Herod sent back Jesus to Pilate, and when Pilate notes that to the Jews, he says, I don't find anything wrong with Jesus, neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. So he is saying, here's somebody who's along my track of thought, you see, and there's a point there, and Pilate maybe wanted company, I don't know. But at least the two of them agree on one thing. There.
Jesus and Herod were both ostensibly Jews, and that means they stood ostensibly on common ground. Jesus can look Herod in the eye without having to say a thing. You know the promise, you know the kingdom, you know how it's supposed to be,
okay.
and I don't have to say anything to you.
Because being Jewish.
Yeah.
Was his mother Jewish, did you say?
His mother was Jewish.
Well, then he probably knew about looking for the Messiah.
He
and so
pretended
forth.
to be 100%. He built the temple, So, yeah.
Well, it says he had been wanting to see Jesus for a long time.
And Pilate and Herod were enemies. But
Rivals, probably.
after...
Rivals is probably what exactly, political rivals.
Yeah.
That's really.
Well, in my Bible it said enemies.
Yeah.
And after Pilate sent Jesus to Herod, Herod was flattered, evidently, because he said then they became good friends.
Yeah, that's a point. That's
Isn't
a good
that
point.
amazing? Political world back there, too.
I think for Pilate, he was just trying to get rid of the case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're not my jurisdiction anyway, so...
Clever out.
At least the way Luke presents it, Pilate seems almost disinterested. In the Gospel of John, he asks some very serious legal questions, and you can see a number of developments. But here, it's just sort of like,
Yeah.
I don't see any.
Well, he wants to get rid of the case.
Yeah.
What's the point of this case? I mean, they raised these charges, and we may wonder how he thought the way he did, namely declaring him innocent in view of it. But he wants to get rid of this. I don't think he wants to deal at any length with this. And these Jewish people are problematical, and there's a connection between how they feel and how they view things and how his status will be with Rome, and there's a lot of things, He has to watch out at the same time that he is
Okay.
Pilate.
Okay.
But he has to watch out for the Jewish contingent here.
Well, there have been 2 or 3 encounters earlier, according to extra-biblical history, that Pilate had on several occasions made offensive blunders that really got the religious leaders upset and so forth.
I
So he was in
remember
a bit of
reading
trouble,
that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Like bringing the standards into the temple, the
And putting the
Roman
pictures
emperors.
on the sword or
on the shields.
yeah, on the
things like that.
shields, yeah, because the Jews were so against anything that
And he raided the temple treasury to build an aqueduct for Jerusalem. He thought they'd appreciate that.
Yeah.
But,
they didn't.
Quintessentially Roman values.
so a little bit of a historical background here is that Pilate has repeatedly run afoul of the local leadership. And we have some sense from extra-biblical material that he was in trouble with the emperor, and it was kind of said to him, one more
Thing and you're
problem
out.
like this and you're out. So
Well,
he's,
and those Jews, as you know from the story,
Difficult.
had put him on the spot when they wouldn't, they didn't like it that those emblems were coming into the temple or into Jerusalem. And you remember the story. They fall on they beseech him for a long period of time, not to do this thing, and he's intent on doing it, and then they lie down on the ground and, stick their necks out, and he says, I'll lop them off if you continue this. And they continue this, And they called his bluff, although you have to watch out because the descriptions of Pilate by Josephus and so on make him an intensely cruel man.
Yeah.
See, but he's got to play politics too.
Yeah.
So they caught him on this, and now I think he's wary of them.
He's not afraid to perhaps overstep. Luke himself tells us in chapter 13 about how Pilate had butchered a bunch of Galileans and making their sacrifices. So Pilate is not, his hand is not stayed by ethical or moral qualms at all.
No,
But nonetheless,
no.
Pilate wants to cut right to the core here, and he wants to do it quickly. He doesn't want to let this rabble go on. And so I think you've got it, John. I think he simply says, come on, let's get to the bottom of this. And he can't. Jesus, you know, I think this lays the foundation for the gospel spread in the Roman Empire afterwards, because it goes to many countries. Thomas apparently takes it as far as India. The question then becomes, who is Jesus? Is he an avatar of one of the Indian divinities? And again, we see that kind of adaptiveness on Jesus' part. Whatever you all want me to be, I am that, but I am more. He fits their boxes, but never completely. He always breaks the envelope in some way. So again and again, we see the way in which the gospel can adapt itself to local cultures even after Jesus' time. And it may be answers like this. Yeah, if you say so. One of the prophets, John the Baptist, Elijah. We see this again and again in Mark and Matthew and Luke. Here's Jesus once again doing the same thing. If that's the way you want it, have it your way. But always he's more, isn't he?
Well, if you don't mind my bringing this up from the book of Revelation, one of the fascinating things about Revelation is in the first chapter, you get a picture of Jesus, and it's a strange picture with swords coming out of his mouth and his feet glowing like a fire, you know. And so there's a bunch of characteristics there. Then Jesus comes to each of 7 churches, introduces himself with 1 or 2 or 3 of those characteristics.
Yes.
No church gets the exact same picture of Jesus. No church gets them all. So there's a sense there that we all have a grasp of Jesus once he has come to us, yet it's not a complete one.
Yeah.
And maybe even the 4 Gospels are showing that Jesus is bigger than any one picture, even an inspired picture.
They tried to put them all together, you know, in early times into one flowing narrative. And yet there's 4. It's like putting 4 negatives on top of each other, because we need the picture that each gospel supplies. I've had, maybe we've said this before, but I've had my students actually write, just, you know, read all 4 gospels and describe for me the picture of Jesus as it emerges from each gospel. Well, it's not the identical picture. There are obviously many things in common, but each one has a way of seeing Jesus. That just fits what you were saying from the book of Revelation.
If the incarnation is divine accommodation of human culture, surely we have the setup for it in Jesus' own ministry that carries forward. I think Revelation is right on to that in the opening chapters.
Well, one of the neatest assignments, I think, that I've ever shared with students is taking a synopsis like you have here, Ivan. And I don't know if the viewers can see it, but it has the Gospels in 3 columns. And so you can readily see. What I had the students do is if these words appeared in all 3, they would mark them in yellow. If they appeared only in Matthew and Luke, they'd mark it in blue. If they appeared in Matthew and Mark, they'd mark it in green, and so on. So I had them do different colors. Now, the interesting thing about it is the yellow, it jumps out what all 3 had in common. It was sort of that common tradition. What wasn't marked was the parts that were unique to each gospel. And so they would read the story, but suddenly would pop out these unique elements. And I never had a class that they didn't say, I got 100 sermons out of this exercise, because suddenly things that had been hidden to them in the Bible just jumped right out at them. So each of these gospel writers has a unique perspective, and Herod is here for a reason. He's not there for a reason in Matthew and Mark.
Well, this whole question, I marked up one time a Greek Testament just this way. I mean, a Greek harmony, you know, in the Greek language, the columns. And what jumps out is the similarities, like you were mentioning, and then the differences. Now, some people get bothered by the differences, but those differences are very, very interesting. They're unique in many ways, and they tell us something about how we should better conceive the inspiration of the Bible.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, obviously, each writer, well, we were saying already, there's 4 portraits of Jesus, and each writer has certain concerns and selects certain materials. You know, the other one may not select the same materials. There's a lot of common stuff between them. John, of course, is the one that is, what, over 90% new, and so on. That's why we don't find John. Well, we do find harmonies that have John, but they're not quite the same. So little
I think
is
the
parallel.
reason, Ivan, that as you've put it so nicely, that they're different in all of these books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is because they're human beings, and they, in their minds, they stress certain things that the other person doesn't.
Well said. Well said.
Here's an interesting point. That maybe it's a little off the point, but I think it flows from this. When the early church was attempting to come to grips with the New Testament,
Yeah.
what are we going to accept of the work of the apostles and of those who were close to the apostles? What of all of this material are we going to accept as valid as canon for the community? You know, they saw how the Old Testament had been shaped and come into being within their very lifetimes, perhaps in the late 1st century or a little bit after that. And so now they were saying, but perhaps here's the second witness, now the witness to Jesus. There were 2 options out there. A fellow named Marcion had the option. He says, you know, there's a lot of junk out there. He says, I really think ultimately the only person you can trust is Paul and Luke a little bit. So he had portions of Luke, the less Jewish parts, and some of the letters of Paul, and that was it.
Yeah.
Because he selected out of all this material the things that gave a very sharp, narrow focus of where he was at.
Yeah.
So one option is you could make the canon small enough and focused enough that everybody can understand it's all clear.
Yeah.
The other option was a fellow named Montanus, and he said, anybody who's got the Spirit is as inspired as the apostles. So now the New Testament becomes almost infinite in size. What the church saw under the inspiration of the Spirit, I believe, is that we needed a broad canon but a closed one.
Broad, what do you
well
mean
said.
canon for our viewers?
Canon means
The Bible?
in this case, it means a collection of documents that are considered to belong together. In this case, to be inspired by God to give guidance to the church through the centuries.
Okay.
And the church decided not in a narrow canon that would pick one thread and say everybody's got to be like this. We want a broad canon that meets a variety of minds, but not so broad that anything goes. So it cut the middle between a really focused and easy to understand thing and an anything goes perspective.
Yeah.
And I think that was very wise on the early church's part, and probably that wisdom came from above.
But you know, when these writings were not all united in one book,
Yeah.
it was one thing how you would look at them. Now when they got all put in one set of covers, one of 2 things happens. You can say, well, it is such a unity that everything is saying about the same thing, and then you flatten out the diversity of witness. You
That's
just
the most
flatten it out.
common answer today.
That's a common answer. Or you can say, wow, all of this diversity, all this variety in one set of covers. You know, unity in diversity. And you can come at it and look at it altogether differently. Now, I certainly would opt for that second one. I think you
Okay, say unity in diversity. Speak to that for our viewers, please.
Well, just like we have 4 Gospels
Yeah.
with 4 portraits, if you study each one
Right.
for itself,
Okay.
4 portraits of Jesus, but there's a complementarity between them as well. I mean, they're all testifying to the same Jesus and so on, but they give.
Well, one writer stresses something,
Yeah.
the other one may not stress that particular
right.
thing. Just like with Luke, he didn't stress about the woman who had this bleeding issue for years.
right.
It made him look pretty bad.
Well,
See?
you're explaining the unity and diversity very well. That's just exactly what we're talking about. And there's a lot could be said, of course, on unity and diversity. You have to spell out both of them, in what sense it's diversity and what sense it's a unity as well. Even God, I mean, we talk about a Trinity, which is a combination of two words, tri-unity. I remember my mother and father fighting it out over, are there, three or one?
Yeah,
And,
I fight that out with my little Arab strawberry man who comes over from Palestine every year and sells strawberries. And he says, you have three gods, we only have one.
Yeah.
And their father is Ishmael, and he was born first.
Yeah.
See?
Well, we really don't have three gods. But how to properly explain that to some
I
folks
didn't even
is
try.
Yeah, maybe that's better.
Yeah. Agree with him as much as you can, because he's right,
But then,
Ishmael.
I haven't been part of this discussion along the way, but how did you conclude? What is the unique picture of Jesus that Luke has? Can you summarize that in 20, 30 seconds?
It's a good moment to ask that because we're coming down to the end of the gospel now. I think along the way, an important aspect of it is that Jesus in Luke is friend of the dispossessed, of women, of Gentiles, of children, of poor people, people who were not thought of as blessed, the marginalized. Certainly that, from the opening Magnificat on Mary's lips right down to the end, is one important thread. There are others, but yeah.
Yes, and you discover that when you compare the Gospels together. Luke is constantly putting women in the story when everyone else leaves them out.
Yeah.
And kids, too. Along with women come the children.
Yeah, okay.
Well, very good. I see we're just in a countdown mode here. So I'd like to remind our viewers, this is Carolyn Thompson, along with these scholars, saying join us next time on Searching for Answers.